powerful podcast for you today where I get to interview my friend, Jenny Marcelene. She is a writer and a passionate about getting the love of Jesus to the nations. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her, and then we're going to get rolling with this interview. Jenny Marcelene lived cross-culturally for 6 years. She loves exploring new cultures and encouraging families to treasure Jesus above all else. Her publishing credits include a wide array of print and online pieces, including the Gospel Coalition, Risen Motherhood, and Parent Life magazine, and contributions to David C. Cook's Wonder Inc. Sunday School curriculum. To the Ends is her debut children's chapter book series, which I am so thrilled about. Once upon a time, Jenny did work as a kids ministry coordinator for her local church, which really kind of propelled her into this writing for young readers. When she's not chipping away at her fiction book, Jenny writes and edits nonfiction articles, and Jenny serves as a content editor for the Living by Design Ministries. In the wild, you can find Jenny walking her 2 labradoodles, kayaking, or cheering along the sidelines of her children's sports games. This is going to be an inspiring podcast. Let's get into it. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Raising Rices podcast. Hopefully, you got to hear the introduction that inspired you to listen today as we have a guest on, my new friend, Jenny, and we are so excited to hear about a launch that she has actually launched 2 days before this recording. So I won't give it away yet, even though, again, if you listen to the introduction, you already know. But we kind of got connected, Jenny and I, through a group of ladies, Christian moms who wanted to encourage and support other moms. And so this is just so fitting for our podcast today. And we're really excited to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here today.
So we're going to begin our conversation today with a big question, because it's the foundation of all of us. And I was just wondering, where did your journey of faith begin? And how has God led you to this place here of writing children's books?
Yeah, so my journey began a while ago, about when I was about 7 years old. I got invited to go to vacation Bible school with one of my friends. And so I went with her. And my parents, I would say, were Christians, but when they moved to the state of Colorado, where I grew up, they were having a hard time finding a church. And so I didn't grow up really, from my perspective at that point, of hearing the gospel or consistently being in the church. So when I went to this vacation Bible school, the teacher there shared the gospel and then asked if I wanted to put my faith in Jesus, essentially. And I just was like, yeah, this was incredible news to me. I just felt like I had never heard this before. And so it was at that young age that I put my faith in Jesus. And I also realized, because I was 7, and this was a long time ago, so they probably should have asked my parents before they did this. But I also recognized, what I can now say was the Holy Spirit. I recognized something had changed in me, and there was this mild panic as a 7-year-old, because I realized also, without anyone telling me, I couldn't undo it. That I knew I had made this huge decision, and then all of a sudden I was like, "Oh no, I didn't ask my parents' permission," you know? And but God was at work in all of that. And so it was really beautiful though. And then through that experience, my whole family ended up kind of coming. My parents found that the church I came to know Jesus at was a church I grew up in from that point onward. And my whole family was baptized together at that church. And so God really used that. So that was sort of the beginning kind of launching of my faith and my family, of coming together and starting to consistently go to church together and try to follow God together. And then you kind of fast forward to writing, and how writing kind of blended into that. Writing was always sort of the best way that I could express myself. And so God really used that a lot to really help me to think deeply about my own faith. And so I found journaling was a way that I really interacted well with God. And so, and just helped me ponder and think more deeply on his word. And so over the years, God began to kind of lead me towards using writing as sort of a ministry opportunity. But initially wasn't something that I was writing more exclusively in the Christian realms. In college, it was more telling other people's stories. And then over time, later on, and maybe in the last, 5 to 8 years, I would say it's come more into trying to really kind of share from scripture and sort of think deeply and kind of walk alongside other people and how we kind of do that well. So that faith journey has sort of been interesting how God's navigated even like that gift of writing and trying to steward it well to bring him glory and honor and follow him in the ways that he would have me to use that to kind of point others to himself because he's really what it's all about.
I love it. I love it. That's so good. And on our podcast, we're really passionate about raising households that serve the Lord. And I know that you are now part of a new household apart from your parents and that journey that you guys got baptized together at that church. What a beautiful story. And I love to hear how, like, little things, like when people serve in like a VBS capacity or doing like a community event, sometimes it can feel wearing or like in the moment you're like, this is so great, and then afterwards you're like, I wonder what happened. Right, I wonder what happened to that student that was there. And so it's so encouraging to hear those testimonies. I think it just spurs us on to share the gospel more, and I love that you shared that with us today. So coming back to the podcast and how our mission is raising households that serve the Lord. How do you think now in your family unit and those that you are inspiring through your writing, how does that phrase, raising households that serve the Lord, how does that shape your path or shape your mindset as we look at the verse from Joshua 24:15?
Yeah, I think for me, I always think partly really what God's laid on my heart is this idea of my family, like, what does it look like to treasure Jesus?
Mm,
And so always trying to think from that mindset because I think it can feel really overwhelming and intimidating sometimes to recognize as parents we're the primary disciplers of our children. And it can feel a bit overwhelming because we love Jesus and we want our kids to love Jesus, but sometimes it can feel this pressure. Sometimes I feel like you've gotta be something that you're not sometimes, but I think just really leaning into that and figuring out, like, what does it look like? Because I think as you can probably attest to, it really does change giving on the seasons you have, like, what your household looks like, the ages that you have in your household, and those different dynamics, and so I think for me, it's a constantly leaning into Jesus, and, when my kids were younger, it looks very different for how we would try to figure out what it looked like to treasure Jesus together versus sort of how it looks now that my oldest sort of does some of his own Bible study on his own. And so I think for me, it's just that intentionality, like just looking for small habits that we can cultivate together and training opportunities that one tool that I might use with them to try to help teach them to think about God's word and study. We won't always do that forever. Like I went through a season where we did oral Bible storying together. I didn't do that forever, but it was a really sweet season where we would do that and memorize, stories together and retell them and think about them all week. And now I'm doing different sets. And so I think just the idea of just looking for small moments and just being consistent and trying to do it well and trusting that these little small habits really do cultivate faith over a course of a lifetime, and it's hard to believe that this 3 minutes that we're gonna spend praying together on the way to school can matter, but I really do believe that's exactly how God works. It's just the small acts of everyday obedience and faithfulness He really can multiply in their lives, and that makes it, I think, feel a little more manageable in my own life of trying to figure out how do I treasure Jesus as well.
I love that. And I love your expression, treasure Jesus, because when I look at that verse, like, as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. It's not like we will just know who he is or we'll just be able to like recite some information about him, but it's like a whole life change. And I
Mhm.
think I hear that in your beautiful encouragement, even to moms that are listening right now. It's just those small moments throughout the day. It's like the whole picture. It's not boiled down to one thing, right? Like
Yeah,
one
totally.
moment.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so I kind of want to maybe shift gears a little bit and get a little bit more information to kind of know Jenny about like your background and some of the influences that you have. I know you have a few that are quite different than many people listening. I know they're different from me, and so I can't wait to hear and be encouraged by that. But from reading your website, I understand that you spent 6 years, I believe,
Mhm.
living in like a conservative Muslim country or countries. Now I'm trying to remember, sorry. And how did that like cross cultural experience shape your view of God
Mhm.
and of your mission here and of your storytelling? Like you said, how you started off retelling stories. How did that experience shape you?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people who have also, lived cross-culturally, it does change, like, how you see the world just because you're forced to kinda step into a different culture and a different way of doing things, and all of a sudden, you're sorta challenged to think, like, "Is this good? Is this bad? Or is this just different?" And I think that is a really beautiful, gift to get to have because in those moments of stepping into different cultures, you begin to see things that you really love about this new culture that's sometimes better than your home culture, but then sometimes you see things that are, like, kinda not so great, and you recognize this is areas that they need the gospel to transform them, and just like our own culture still has those same things too, and so I think for me, it really I think I didn't really understand culture until I really had to live in other cultures in the sense of understanding American culture. Like I knew it, right? 'Cause I'm from that culture and I'm immersed in it. But I think having spent time overseas and then be able to come back, I've been like, oh, this is a cultural part of what this is a cultural thing. This isn't like necessarily a biblical truth. This is a culture. And I could start to say, this is cultural and this is biblical. And it began to help me to kind of see things from different lenses, I think, and kind of understand aspects of God's character differently too, because I could say this part of this culture really shows the generosity of God in ways that like this, and it began to help me to see the beauty and diversity of who God is by these different cultures showing different facets of his character sometimes. Again, no culture is perfect, obviously. And so every culture still needs gospel transformation. But I think living and getting to be a part of these different cultures just challenges you in different ways and sort of deepens your faith in new ways just because you're challenged to kind of rethink things sometimes and to recognize, okay, I'm going to be pushed to the Bible here and say, like, what does the Bible teach on this type of topic? Or what is a biblical way to view this instead of just the way that I culturally had? And it doesn't mean that I do that perfectly because I don't, but it does challenge you to think, is this biblical or is this cultural? And it's a good dynamic to be aware of. Neither it's not wrong to do something because of our culture, but it helped me to kind of pull apart those a lot more. So I think, is this a biblical way to look at this or is this just a cultural way? And so I think that's also been an advantage of getting to kind of live overseas for me anyway. That was one benefit that really taught me to kind of be thinking a little bit more in those terms so that I could kind of be more aware of what was going on in a context and think, let me think about this from the biblical perspective, not just a cultural perspective.
That is fascinating. That is very, very intriguing where you leave one culture to go to a next, and then you have to define what is biblical worldview, not on based where I was,
Mhm.
but just the Bible, right? The truth of God's word. That is very, I have never heard that before. I like that perspective. And then we were talking, it kind of reminded me of I tried to learn, Spanish
Mm.
in high school, and, is a right
Yeah.
response. I didn't get very far, but what I realized was that I had a greater appreciation for English because that's what
Mhm.
helped me understand how to, conjugate verbs
Yep.
and whatnot. Like, I started with a foundation of something and was able to apply that, but then and I think this is maybe where I'm kinda hearing your, like, you have to take apart the culture is that we use like here in America like slang words or things that are not proper and you being a writer would know way more about that than me, but it kind of seems like an illustration of like, oh well, we just say this but that's not what we mean or
Mm.
things like that where figuring out well, what is truth apart from culture,
Yeah.
or cultural influence, I should say. So that's really interesting. I'm gonna chew on that a little bit.
Well, and I think also even learning new language, like even how, they express things in that language is different than how I would in English. And so you're reworking like, okay, I don't like this because this isn't how I did it. And I don't think like this. And so, even when the language I was learning, you don't conjugate the subject in past tense, you're to conjugate the object. Like it's like all these different ways to view, and it could feel disorienting, but it's good in the sense of it reminds us that like there are a lot of different ways to see things. And ultimately the Bible gives us that lens to look at it through. But it's good sometimes to be uncomfortable and be forced outside of our comfort zones to see things from a different perspective, even if it's not the way that we grew up doing it.
That's very, very cool. I like that. And I think like from hearing you, it brought you back here to America with a deeper appreciation for multiple cultures and most importantly for God's word. I think
Yeah,
that
absolutely. Yeah, because it does. It just when you're not in a familiar context, as you know, you do, you gotta go to what you know is unchanging and steadfast, and that is God and Word. So that sort of gives you your grounding when everything else can sometimes be like, "I don't know how to say where how much are these tomatoes?" Like, it gives you grounding in things when they're a little bit, changing for you and you're still trying to figure things out.
Yeah, very, very cool. And so, when did your writing passion or calling begin? And what kind of like transformation has it gone on? Because it sounds like you didn't start writing children's books, but
Mm-mm.
started somewhere else. So can you tell us a little bit about that journey to how you got to where you are today?
Yeah. It's always hard to summarize long journeys, huh? Like, you always think
Right,
like,
I
"Okay,
know.
what's
I'm
the
so
best way
sorry.
to," but overall, no, it's, I think, a good reminder of just God's faithfulness through every season. Like I said, initially, I really just thought that I wanted to tell people stories, and I thought I would only just do that in 2,500 words or less. Like, I sort of thought that's, like, what I'm good at. That's what I love doing. I love to interview people. I love to hear people's stories, and then I like to kind of pull those together, like, magazine feature story writing I really loved because I could, like, tell a really good story. And, like, I love that opportunity just to tell people's stories and make them come to life. And so that was a really fun thing. And then as time went on, God continued to give me more opportunities to do different types of writing, from grant writing to kind of doing stuff, writing stuff for volunteer stuff. And then, over time, writing prayer guides and trying to invite people into how they would pray for a people group, and getting those opportunities. And then over time, getting more and more opportunities to do different types of writing was actually helpful for me. And I think by the time, I got back to the States, the second time, I was beginning to want to take a little more serious steps into writing. And so I think all of those things kind of culminated, all these past experiences of living cross culturally and really liking to tell people's stories and wanting to invite people in to pray for people. Those all sort of came together. And I began to do more nonfiction article writing, which I had always kind of done, but I wasn't so story based anymore, which was uncomfortable for me. And initially I was like, I can't do this. And then with the right support and structure and skill building, it is possible, but it doesn't always feel like that. And then, God uses that to kind of springboard into the next thing, which for me ended up being children's fiction. But that wasn't something, 20 years ago, I would have ever thought that I would want to step into writing fiction for kids. But it spurred on from just time with my kids at that point, and recognizing I was reading when my now sixth grader was in first grade. We were reading an obscene amount of chapter books. And I began to recognize that pattern of, like, hey, there's not that many Christian chapter books, like books written like Magic Treehouse style, like 6 to 10-year-olds. There were a lot of middle grade, that bigger, thicker level, for 8 to 12-year-olds that are fabulous. There were those there, but there was a lot less of the Christian ones. And I love reading all types of books, but I loved if I could have sprinkled in a little more of that Christian worldview stuff into what we were reading, just to kind of have that variety. And so I began to realize this is a gap. And then I was looking for resources for my kids too, of wanting to cultivate that heart for God's nation. God's love for the world and making his name great. And it was hard to find good kids resources for that were engaging for kids and not just dry facts or something. And so that's when God could have brought those two together for me. And he was like, you can write the resources that you wish existed for your kids. And so that sort of, it was like Magic Treehouse meets God's heart for the nations, and sort of trying to bring fiction into this equation to kind of help pull kids into these worlds in ways that build connection to, rather than isolation from, these other cultures and worldviews and what God's doing around the globe, trying to invite people in to kind of get a front row seat to how God's working. So yeah, so that's sort of what brought me into fiction. It wasn't that I initially ever thought I love reading fiction. I had never thought about writing fiction until that moment when I was recognizing there's this gap, and I felt like God was like, "Well, why don't you step into that gap?" And that was like, "Oh, okay." So it was this moment of stepping out in faith and saying, "Okay, God," learning from doing all these different types of varieties of writing over the years. God was just like, "Well, just trust me." And there is always, with the right structure, support, and skill building, God can guide you to be equipped to do things. It's just, it can be one of those, those steps of faith of just trusting that God can do that no matter what he calls us to, whether it's writing a book or doing a certain ministry or raising kids, it's all the same. It's just that faith building exercise that he gives us to trust him.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And I totally agree. I homeschool. Well, right now I have 7 kids and 5 of them are in school. My oldest is 7th grade, my youngest in school is 1st grade, and you're so right. Like that beginning reader, like we're past the levels, but we're not quite to the big chapter books. And like, I mean, this isn't my first rodeo,
Yes,
but
yeah.
after trying to collect and collect and collect, you collect some, but the biblical worldview is definitely missing.
Mhm,
God's character can be found, as we talked about, in many things,
mhm.
but sometimes it's not as explicit as they need when they're that age. Like,
Totally.
I even remember, like, we live over here next to the Tetons in
Oh,
Yellowstone. It's beautiful, it's lovely. But I realize if I don't point out to my kids, like, look what God created, like, let's
mhm.
look at God's character in this, it's honestly just they just receive it as a beautiful thing instead of connecting God to the creation
Yeah.
that he created. And I'm so excited to get your book. And so let's transition to your book. Um and can you tell us a little bit, what is The Dreamer to the ends about, like in your own words? Obviously, we're going to want to buy it and read it for ourselves, but give us a little teaser. And what is the heart behind the story? We hear your heart behind writing, and I'm like, yes and amen. Thank you for hearing God's call and responding to that, because us moms and families who have the same desire as you to raise households that serve the Lord need those resources that God
Mhm.
has put on your heart and others. And so we're thrilled. So can you tell us a little bit about your book, The Dreamer?
Yeah, so in the first book, in the first book with the dreamer, two brothers, Jason and Fred, they discover this board game in this castle while they're on at summer camp, and so they come home and they end up playing this board game, and they get this mission that they have to deliver a holy book to a dreamer, and then they end up getting miraculously transported by a hot air balloon to Afghanistan, where they have to execute this mission essentially, but they really have no idea who the dreamer is, and they don't really have any idea of like where to even start it. And then they end up discovering they have a ticking time clock that they have to finish before time runs out, or they don't get to accomplish their mission, and there's consequences for that. And so for them, it's this idea to like step into this world. And so the point of sort of the heart behind this book is sort of just to create this faith-based adventure around God's heart for the nations and how he sort of uniquely works in these cultures that's different than how he might in America. And so the story sort of takes families on this adventure, but this is like what God's doing every day in these cultures, right? Like, so this is fun and exciting, but it's also like God uniquely works in these cultures and they're different than here. And so the hope is as they families sort of go on this adventure with the boys of like, well, how are you going to deliver this holy book to this dreamer and the challenges that come with that? Also learning like you begin to build connection to these characters, these Afghan characters that they'll meet, and the hope is that that sort of sparks prayer for this part of the world, right? That as you sort of meet these characters and they don't become this, sometimes I think when we hear about different cultures and in different worldviews, it can feel like a sort of these at a distance, kind of keep them in arm's length, be a little bit fearful. And the hope is we can sort of invite in to be like, no, like there's real beauty here that you can see and engage with. And that after having met some of these characters on the page, you sort of feel a connection to this culture and want to pray. And so that's sort of the heart behind the book there. And also just the story is to kind of invite into this grand adventure that God's already doing this kind of stuff. And we just don't always get to hear about it because that's the question at the beginning of the book. The 10-year-old Jason really is like, is God still really working around the world? And so that's sort of the question that this series answers. Is God still working around the world? And what does that look like if he is?
No, I love it. I love it. We had a friend that were missionaries over to the Middle East. And to me, like thinking about them in that place, you're right. It kind of like you put up a wall or you get like maybe some nervousness, like that they're just so different or I don't understand. And they came back and told us a little bit about how they prompted
Mm,
conversations. We all are made in God's image, right? Like we
yep.
all have some foundational things that we can connect on. And also because we are made in God's image, we all have things that we appreciate about the creator. And so now just trying to have those conversations by finding they called them people of peace, people that
Yeah,
wanted to talk about
totally.
peace and they wouldn't say, Jesus Christ right away, right? But
Totally.
then, like,
Yeah.
all of the similarities came to where then they got to present the gospel. And I hear that in you describing this book where, like, we can gain a love for God's people despite maybe like we were way in the beginning of this podcast talking about like cultural differences
Mhm,
that have intimidated us or have caused us to view certain cultures a certain way.
mhm.
And so I'm really excited about this book because of that, especially being here in America, where sometimes we view things in the Middle East as very like us against them,
Okay.
where the gospel is for everyone, right?
Yes,
Is
absolutely.
cross-cultural, and I'm very excited about that, and, was it being in those conservative Muslim countries that was your inspiration for this book, or was there, like, a particular moment that you were like, "This is where the idea from the book came from?"
Yeah. Well, so I think essentially when I realized, like, when I was with my son, like this, so having spent, 6 years in conservative Muslim countries, I obviously just have a real love for Muslims and really desire, to really pray for that part of the world as well. So I have a deep love for that part of the world. So it's sort of why the first book is diving into the world of Islam a little bit in Afghanistan. But the idea behind, with this first book is my vision for it was like to because I wanted it to be a resource for families about missions essentially, and I wanted to walk through the 5 worldviews that of religions outside of Christianity, which is Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, animism, and unreligious. And so that was the initial idea behind the series was like I want to walk through these so that because I saw so many people feeling like there's a lot of fear around these other worldviews, especially like in conservative cultures, and having to live in a different culture that was all a different worldview and you're very much the minority, you very much have to lean into life and you begin to realize like these aren't things to be fearful of. Like these are opportunities to lean in and sort of learn like, okay, where does the gospel speak to this culture? And so I think that's my hope with these books. And that was the vision. So that was the initial idea. Like I want to walk through and show that God is working in these cultures and we don't have to be scared. The gospel can stand up to these
Yeah.
different worldviews. Like we don't have to be fearful for that our kids engage with someone who's a Buddhist. Or, like we can teach them like these are some beautiful things about this culture, but here's where the gospel meets them, and we can pray and engage with them on these levels. And so that was sort of the initial idea behind the series, so that we'd have an overview of kind of what it would look like to step into worldviews that aren't like our own, but again from that biblical lens, so we wouldn't be fearful that we'd have this grounding that like the Bible is our foundation as we set into this. And because of my love for Muslims and my experience in conservative Muslim cultures, I really wanted to start with Islam because that's when I just love that. I love Muslims so much. And so that was sort of my desires. I really wanted to start there. And so on that journey, just because it was something I was really familiar with and being new to writing kids fiction a few years ago, it was also a little more like, okay, I have so much known stuff to work with and start with that it was helpful to have some of that be less stressful because I could kind of think a little bit more on the art of writing and the craft. Even though I still had to do research, obviously, but it was a little less intimidating because it was a little more of a known factor.
Ah, so this is gonna be a series. When is it when
Yeah.
right? Ah,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Book
very
2, I'm already
excited.
working on, and it's based in Sri Lanka. So that one, Lord willing, will come out next fall. So fall 2026, Lord willing.
This
So
is so exciting, and I love it, like, I think that in, Christian circles, we tend to save the things that might feel difficult, like presenting multiple worldviews to like later, like when they're older. But what a powerful thing to introduce that when they're younger so that we can build on it.
yes.
And
Yeah.
starting the introduction phase by always returning back to the truth of biblical worldview and still like exposing or looking at the other ones. I love that. That's gonna be very powerful. Like, obviously, this is gonna be a thrilling, exciting, adventureful book, but I love things that are, like, dual purpose, right? Like, if
Yeah.
I'm gonna spend my energy and time doing something, then it needs to not return void, right? It needs
Totally.
to come
Yeah.
back and be, like, strengthening me, my family, my faith, and, I find that, though, with literature a lot, even as an adult, sometimes I can read something just for fun
Mhm.
or, um, like, even watching shows sometimes, like an
To
escapism,
yeah, totally.
fault of my own, and I walk away from those moments thinking, "What was the point?" Like, I just
Mhm.
wasted that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so I'm
been
just
there.
so excited to offer my children something that is fun and engaging, right? Something that is enjoyable,
Yes, yeah.
but is meaningful and is going to be creating that depth of their biblical worldview as they expand looking at other ones. I think I'm just so excited, Jenny. Look at me. I'm just like,
Well,
sign
thank
me
you.
up.
Yeah, I'm excited too, and I hope other people agree. Yeah, so I'm excited to get this into the hands of families because it is the resource that I wish I had for my boys, essentially,
Yes.
and because I love fiction so much and my kids love fiction so much, it just seemed like a natural. We have historical fiction, so this is sort of like taking that idea, making its own like missions fiction genre for kids instead of just biographies, because I think we
Yeah.
take down our guard
Mm.
differently in fiction, and so I think
Yeah.
we have a unique opportunity to kind of share and speak into that space in a way that we can't, even if they're reading a missionary biography. It sort of lets us actually put ourselves in these shoes and experience something in a different way. And we take it in differently when we read fiction versus nonfiction. And so it was intentional to do fiction because I was like, this is the best way to sort of bring kids along in this journey in God's heart for the nations.
That's powerful. And like, I'm just thinking of myself. I'm like, yes, I totally read nonfiction different than I read fiction. I put
Hmm.
myself into the story when I read fiction, but nonfiction, it's more just like information,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Like, wow, that is so good. And like these truths we know, or these, things about differences of what we read, we know, but now we get to apply it. We get to
Hmm.
apply it with your book and the series, which I'm very excited about. So here's a unique question. Were there any like challenges or surprises that you faced while writing, editing, or publishing a children's book? How did that
Oh,
go?
well, so many things I could share. But one thing that's kind of funny. So, so it took me because I hadn't written children's fiction, I had a lot of learning to do. Um, and so there's, over the course of about 4 years, I was working on this, on this process. But by the time we got to kind of finalizing things, with my publisher and everything, I was like, okay, well, I want to have some beta readers to give me some feedback on this. I got some families to kind of read it and give me some feedback before like I passed on this final version to my editor. And I remember thinking, okay, let's see how this goes. And then they like almost not everyone, but there is enough people that there is a part where when the boys get transported, from playing the board game to where they get transported in the hot air balloon. A lot of times in books like that, like when you think of Ranger in Time and Imagination, there's like this sequence of stuff, weird stuff, noises, lights, all that kind of stuff that happens. So when I had written mine, one of the things I had said, um, ended I liked it a lot, and I had my kids read it multiple times, and lots of editors had said it, and then all of a sudden I give it to families, and they're like, "That's creepy," and I was like, "Wait, what? Like this is like 3 or 4 years, like no one's ever said that, but a couple people are starting to say that," and so I'm like, "Oh, I need to change this," and I pulled to my kids and I said, "Is this creepy?" And they're like, "Yeah." I was like, "Why didn't you tell me?" They told me about other things, so it's just this funny moment of like, that is really not the vibe I was going for right before they get transported somewhere. Creepy wasn't the vibe that I was going for. It was like this voice that said, like whispered or something. And they're like, "That's creepy." And I was like, okay. And so like I rewrote like that whole paragraph, and it's like, let me rethink like what it needs to fill. And then I was like, "Is this creepy?" And they're like, "No." And I was like, okay, then we're gonna go with this. But it was just at the very end, like you think like it would have come up sooner. So it's just for me, it's funny how some things you can kind of just not realize don't come off quite the way you intended and be so close to like a finish line and be like still like, oh wait a second, this needs to be fixed. So that was sort of like a surprising element because it just wasn't what I was expecting, but I'm so happy that it was brought up to me so that I could fix it because I don't want it to be creepy at that moment. So very good to fix it because that was not what I imagined in my head. So it was a great moment to make a change and a very needed one. So I'm so thankful for my beta readers for fixing that for me. So
Oh, that's hilarious. That's so funny.
yeah, it
That's
was not
just
the vibe I was going for,
no.
so glad to be aware of it, so
Oh, I love it. I love it. And it's really fun to like hear from the author and to hear just some of the things that go into writing because we get the final product, but it takes lots of time, lots of
yes, yeah.
energy, lots of hands involved. And it's just fun. It's a fun perspective to have. So in this book, The Dreamer, how do you like define biblical worldview for the children? Like, is it obvious or is it assumed? And how, like, as parents, I'm thinking, how can we participate in that story with them? Like, is there teaching that needs to go alongside of it,
Mm.
or is the teaching already kind of like, woven in, or what do you think?
Yeah. So I mean, so sort of when I think of biblical worldview, and this is probably what many people probably think of, but just so we're on the same page, I sort of think of just using the Bible as a way that we filter sort of how we see and respond and think about the world and what we encounter. And so in this series, like that's sort of when I'm saying like a biblical worldview, I'm saying like as we look at these different worldviews, we're gonna see them and see some of the beauty, but we're gonna look at it at the lens, from how the Bible might want us to see this a little bit. And so in the book, you don't really, interact with Jason's parents at all, but Jason and Fred are the two main characters, and Jason's primarily the main one that we track with. But and so it's sort of assumed that they're from, like, you get the sense that they're from a Christian household, that you pick when it starts, I make it kind of clear they just got back from a Christian summer camp. Like they're at a Christian summer camp. So I'm sort of just setting the stage that these are kids who are growing up in a Christian household. Again, there is a lot of different thoughts. And like, I don't directly call them Christian. I think there's a lot of intentionality behind that because I think with kids, there's a lot of complications with that. But in other words, just letting you know, like, they are kind of in this Christian world. And so these kids, as far as we can tell, are at this Christian summer camp and are trying to follow Jesus themselves. And so that's sort of the implication of that. So we kind of can have that as a background. But the heart and the main theme of this book, and so this is why I'm saying this is the grounding for the book that does a lot of the hard work, I think, is the key verse, Isaiah 49:6. Which Isaiah 49:6 says, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." And so, one, you can kind of see how the title is to the ends, because this is a
Uh-huh.
grounding key scripture for the whole series. But also, what we see in this text is that God is talking to the Israelites, and he's saying it's too small. It is too small that just one people group know and worship me. So he's saying, I need you to go out and proclaim me to all nations, all languages, all tribes. Like, you need to go out and proclaim, because I am so great and so wonderful and so mighty that everyone needs to know and worship me. I'm not just a God for the Israelites. I'm not just a God for Americans. I am a God for all nations and all peoples. And so that's the grounding of this whole series. And so that, I think that sort of helps give that biblical framework. It's just woven in, because this is what, Jason is essentially struggling with. Like, is this really, what does it look like in practicality that God, wants all people to know and worship him? Does that really actually happening? Because it doesn't always feel like that. Even me, sometimes even in my day-to-day life, where I live, I can just sometimes be like, are people still coming to Jesus? Like, seriously, I can just be like, I don't feel like this is happening, because my experience isn't that. But praise the Lord that, like, our experience doesn't define reality, right? That the
Yes.
reality is so much bigger than ourselves. And so God gets to define that. And so I love, like a month ago, last month, my church did these baptisms up at a lake about 30 minutes up. And like, there was like 60 people getting baptized. I mean, like, and we got to spend an hour and a half listening to all their testimonies before they got baptized. And I was like, okay, people are still coming to Jesus. Like, sometimes it's just so easy to think, oh, okay, I guess something's happening overseas. And so I think part of that is framing it so that we sort of engage with the scripture, like, God cares about this, and so should we. But like, what is he doing over there? And so this sort of helps us, like, it's like that, hearing someone's testimony and watching them get baptized. It's like, what is God doing around the world? And we don't always hear some of those stories. And so that's sort of so this sort of brings parents along to kind of be a part of what God's already doing. And so it's a natural way. I think, there's less hard work on that side, I think, to be done. But then there's always, like, I created like a special family guide that's free that parents can do if they want to go deeper and learning more about the culture and how to pray. But then, there's discussion questions at the back of the book. So really trying to not make it heavy lifting for parents. Like, really just imagine, if this was me and I'm busy, what would I want? And so I tried to create something that, like, helped lay the foundation well for parents. And then if they had time and capacity and interest, they could extend it. But if all they do is read the book, there's a lot of really great stuff that I think will be, a joy for them to get to do together. That's my sort of hope and prayer.
Oh, I love it. And it's going to be such a great resource for families, and even a gift, like, even to like gift this book to someone that maybe is just navigating,
Mhm.
what they feel about Christ and religion and how it all fits in with all these worldviews. That's going to be really, really helpful. What do you, what do you think your biggest hope for with the book, The Dreamer? Like, when it comes to like children's hearts or family lives? What do you think your biggest hope is when that book gets into their hands?
Yeah, I think the bottom line, especially as we think about Afghanistan, so putting it in this world of Islam, which I think has a lot of fear around for a lot of people, I think,
Yeah.
um, is my main hope is just that people would sort of walk away with, like, catching the warmth and beauty of Afghan culture. So I think a lot of times the note people hear, is kind of one of fear and uncomfortableness, and I really hope that they walk away more with a note of kind of curiosity, of just kind of like, "Oh, this is different than I expected." And so again, that's that catching that idea that, like, you know, we can catch glimpses of God's character in every culture, and so beginning to think, "Ah, okay, there is something beautiful I can catch from each culture," while still understanding it needs gospel transformation. So that's my hope, is that they catch an aspect of that, because like I do this because I'm thinking about like a multifaceted diamond, and you're sort of turning it to see what aspect of God's character can I glimpse in this. While even though they still need gospel transformation, just like our own culture needs that. So that's a part that I hope comes through, is beginning to train ourselves to see cultures in a different light. But then also just that this would spark prayer, that people would see like, because we go back to Isaiah 49:6, because God cares that all nations know and worship him, I should care about it. And so this is God's global plan, and an important and key way that not the only way, but an important and key way my family can be a part of this without leaving our living room, is to pray. Like, prayer matters. And now that I have this connection to this part of the world, I can pray. I can, once a week spend a few minutes praying as a family on the way to, soccer practice, or on the way to school drop off, or at Sunday lunch, whatever it is, realizing like we can invite our families into this in a real practical way, that like missions doesn't have to be this like far off, you have to take them on a missions trip to be a part of, that you can step into it just by praying and being informed about how to pray, understanding, having read something and gotten a better insight. Ah, I learned from the story that, a lot of Muslims just think Jesus is a good teacher. Now, when I pray, I can actually be like, oh, God showed them that Jesus is way more than just a teacher. Like, just those
Yeah.
connecting points that feel like they give people tools that, like, oh, I can do this. That's what I want them to walk away.
So
Oh,
good.
I can totally pray for the nations and join God in this. Like, this is something we can do together.
Oh, I love that. And yes, like everything you're saying, like sometimes when we think about missions, we just like remove ourselves because we can't
Yeah.
find the time or the capacity to take our whole family overseas, And so then we just feel maybe helpless or that there's not anything that we can do. But prayer is so powerful. And we can join our whole family to pray for different areas. Like in this first book, a specific demographic or location. But then as you expand in your series, we're going to expand that prayer journey as well.
Yeah.
And we'll just learn how to be intentional, praying that the word of God is spread, the gospel is received. And I think that what I've experienced in my own prayer life is that when I am focused on praying for others, there is a powerful work that's happening inside of me that just
Mhm.
deepens my faith and my assurance of salvation. And I think that I am excited to see whole families be able to embrace that, where even though the focus is praying for someone else, it really just rallies and bolsters their faith as well.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
exciting. So, okay, is has there ever been a book, it could be Christian or not, that has shaped you significantly and why?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I really love fiction, so there's lots of great fiction books, but there is one, nonfiction book that I really love. It's called Sacred Chaos.
Oh.
It's written by actually she's kind of a mentor of mine, but her name is Trisha McCary Rhodes. She's written several books, but Sacred Chaos is probably one of my favorites, because she just is a woman who is beautiful because she has daily just soaked in God's presence and word over a lifetime. And so when she's writing, you can see that it's these short, short chapters, very short, about practical ways to connect with Jesus in the chaos of your life today. So it's again emphasizing the same thing that as parents we're trying to do with our kids, right? Looking for these moments, being intentional, intentionally directing our gaze. Okay, I'm at a stoplight. I'm going to pray to Jesus right now. And so I love what she does, because it's not this whole like, oh, you need to do this exact method. It's just like, figure out how to invite God into your life and chaoticness now, And I love
Yeah.
it because it's just this way of trying to connect with God's presence and start to just treasure Jesus and train our hearts to do that because it's so easy to get fixed on other things like our phones or these busy schedules. And so I love this book because I feel like if have newborns to if your kids are out of, you're an empty nester, like this book is just ideal because I think we can all feel so busy and it's just short, which I love. Like the chapters, with practical, just try this to see if this works to help you connect with God. And it's just so, I love it. Like I think it just cultivates that mindset of looking for opportunities to connect with God.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And it's fiction, like you said?
No, this one is not. This is
Okay.
nonfiction, but because it's so short, it's just yeah,
It's just
it's just a
powerful.
great one. Yeah, yeah. Like
Love
I
it.
have so many fiction books, I was like, but I'll share a nonfiction one
But
because I think it's so important. So yeah.
fair, fair.
Yes, I know because I am super fiction heavy, so, yeah. I have to actually have accountability sometimes to read nonfiction, so but
I know. I feel like for myself, like if I'm reading, I really do enjoy fiction like right before bed if I'm just trying to
mhm.
like, calm down before turning the lights out. But if it's nonfiction, I want to do it in the middle of the day
Yeah,
or,
exactly. Yes,
some
totally.
other
Yep.
time.
Yeah, totally. And I usually need accountability now. I used to in my 20s and maybe even early 30s, I could do like nonfiction on my own if I said it. But since mid 30s, it's been like, nope, I'll have to lead a group in order for me to read this book. So that's basically what I do. Or I'll be like, hey, I would need to read this book. You want to read it with me? And that's basically how I read nonfiction because otherwise I won't. Because I just
Yeah.
love and stories so much that I know it's good for me to read. And there is really great nonfiction. I'm not trying to minimize it, but I just
No.
really, really like fiction. So
That's good. No, no, it's good. And you should be passionate about the things that you're passionate about,
yeah,
right?
totally. Yeah.
So that's so good. My question is like, what encouragement would you give to a mom or a dad listening right now who feels like weary or uncertain about passing their faith onto their kids?
Yeah, I think this is a heavy one because I can remember the moment, when I also felt the same way. And it also, ironically, it was also when I was, I had like an infant at the time and a toddler. And then I was also in charge of running the children's ministry at our church in Chicago. And I remember just having this moment of being like, if I don't know how to do this, how am I going to help other people do this? And it was this idea that, like, oh, this is a heavy thing and it can feel overwhelming. And just to, I think one, I would just encourage people like nobody actually knows what they're doing. Like I just think like just in all honesty, none of us have it all figured out. And even if we get to a season and we think, oh, these things are working, then our kids will change. And then all of a sudden we're back to square one. And so I think it's this understanding that like every family's different too. What works for one family just might not work for you. And so I think there's this grace and understanding that like we do have a responsibility, but God is in charge. And so he's still king. And if you ask him for help to figure out what does it look like for me to just, point my kids to Jesus, he's going to be faithful to give you those tools to help you do that well. And it might look like a storybook Bible, or it might look like a Bible study, or it might look like listening to, these songs that reinforce biblical truth in the car, whatever it is, that like just look for those small things. It doesn't need to be these big, huge things. Just look for one small habit that you can try to cultivate and just be faithful with it and trust that just like that mustard seed, God's going to grow it too.
I love it. I love it. Well, we really want to know all of the ways that the listeners and us can follow you, whether it's your website, newsletter, social media, and most importantly, where to find the dreamer. We need this book in our library.
Oh, and I know that it's got a lovely one. Yeah, so I think the best ways to find me are either I have a website, which is jennymarceline.com, or I also have a blog, which you can link to it from my website, which is just jennymarceline.blogspot.com. And that actually has a lot of free family prayer guides for like world religions and different world religion holidays that come up. Like
Oh,
I wrote one on, in October, we have the Day of the Dead. And so talking about how I navigated that with my family and kind of looking through that lens of how do we navigate our kids and talking through something like that. And so stuff like that, there's just free resources that have activities and recommended resources and prayer requests and stuff like that. Those are all free. And so I always encourage people, that's a great starting place for prayer resources. And then And on that, you can sign up for my quarterly newsletter. But also, the book is available on Amazon. The Dreamer is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and my publisher, Calla Press's website as well. So you can kind of go to any of those major ones, and you should be able to grab a copy of that. And at the back of that, again, is discussion questions. And you go on my website, and the free resources that have the 4-day family guide are available for you. You don't even have to sign up for anything. It's just on there. You can get those, so you don't have to feel like you need one more thing to sign up if that just feels too much right now.
Ugh, I'm so excited. I know I ordered it. I was hoping it would arrive before our podcast today, but I don't live like too remotely, but remote enough that it's not as fast as
Yeah,
I'm
I hear
used
you.
to.
I used to live in Chicago, and now I live in, like, a rural county in California, so I'm feeling I feel you. Like, I'm like, "Oh, things don't come that fast." I used to feel like they came so fast, and now it's like, "Oh,
Yes.
maybe it'll come eventually." So,
One day, or maybe it's okay that it doesn't, right?
totally. I know. That is the reality.
Oh, well, Jenny, we've just enjoyed this podcast and your conversation with you so much. And I know that it's been a blessing to the listeners as it has been to me. And I just thank you for your time and for your willingness to respond to God's calling on your life and how that is just going to affect other families because of that obedience to Him. So thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's been a joy.
Yay. Okay. Well, make sure you give Jenny a follow, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye.